Magic is simple to acquire. Just spill your blood in the domain of an elemental spirit. A roaring river, a wind-swept peak, a wild forest. Issue a challenge, and then survive the contest of wills until you master its name. You wonder what spirits inhabit the ruins of this ancient city. I took a bold step into the abandoned city, evidence of it having been eroded by winds for years before we took on the journey to lay eyes upon it. Percy, my guide, dragged himself behind me, exhausted by the long days and restless nights spent on the desert road, the jiggling of coins in my pocket keeping him moving. As soon as the dust settled around my first valiant step within, we surveyed the area to ensure there were no miscreants that had made this place a home of their own, intending to ambush us at the first opportunity. "Hello?" I called within, Percy waiting tensely for a reply. None came. That brought him little comfort. "Well, there it is in all its splendor," Percy said quickly, flinching as a chunk of the building closest to us chipped off. "The lost city of Zagan. Are you satisfied?" "Very much so," I said, nodding to myself impressively. "You have my thanks." "I did not do this for your thanks," Percy reminded me, eyes weighing heavily on my coin purse. "Ah, indeed," I said, absent-mindedly putting my hand within and pulling out a handful much larger than the agreed-upon price, dropping it in his hands without looking away from the city's tall, aged visage. Gasping audibly, Percy gathered the few coins that spilled over into the sandy ground. I pulled out my sword and Percy yelped, jumping away from me and drooping more coins. "What is this? You intend to rob me after you paid me. I knew I never should have trusted you," Percy hissed, gathering himself over his payment like a hen over eggs and glaring at me intensely. I finally looked his way, my eyebrows folding together as I clicked my tongue in distaste. "The blade is not for your skin but for mine," I announced. His face jumped between bafflement and betrayal half a dozen times before settling on simple confusion, his eye twitching as his head turned to one side. "How do you mean?" Percy asked carefully. I simply demonstrated, pulling a fraction of the blade across the tip of my little finger and letting the open cut spill onto the floor. Percy continued to stare before realization crossed his face. "You seek magic here? Do you believe the city of Zagan holds an elemental? Had that been the case, this city would have been visited years ago in search of its power? No one has crossed onto this side of the desert in ages," Percy said, stunned. "Yes, but they had not visited the library beneath the walls. It made mention of an elemental that destroyed the once grand city of Zagon. I am under the impression that the same elemental never left once it had succeeded in eradicating its new home of the former residents," I explained. Percy looked out at the still empty city, then back to me, his face scrunched. "That sounds—" He looked down at the money in his hands and measured his words. "A bit far-fetched? Perhaps, but this was the only elemental I have the ability to visit. Others are in raging waters or in lands of wind so powerful it is difficult to breathe. This one is simply hidden away," I answered. "In a desert in the middle of nowhere," Percy grumbled, pocketing the money. "How will you know if it's working?" "I already do. Just look," I laughed, elated. The moment the drops of blood made contact with the ground, the sand absorbed it hungrily, not leaving as much as wet darkness in the earth. Leaning closer, Percy raised his eyebrows, looking up to meet my smile. His face finally changed to that of interest. "How long do you have to wait?" he asked, looking out at the city to watch for changes. "The legends say that the way to magic is to continue to give blood until the elemental appears. Then you may ask for its challenge to learn its magic," I replied confidently. That confidence was short-lived. We stood waiting until the shade of the city shifted away from us and we began walking under it, following it like a giant sundial to protect us from the harsh rays of the desert sun. But no matter where my blood dropped, it was immediately absorbed. This went on for at least an hour, during which I had to reopen the wound a painful 5 times to ensure I continued to supply blood in the meantime. Percy winced as I squeezed at my little finger. "How much blood does this require?" Percy finally asked, his earlier interest having waned drastically. "I have not the slightest inkling," I replied, exasperated. "Perhaps swaths more." Percy gasped as I ran my sword against my left palm, allowing it to run freely. The earth continued to swallow the increased flow of blood as soon as it made contact. Percy watched with wide eyes as I continued to stare into the city. What was taking so long? Had I done the summoning wrong? "Elemental! I am here for you!" I called for the umpteenth time. No response. "We seek your magic!" Percy called, much louder than me. It was the first time he tried to call for it himself. His voice echoed back impressively, but otherwise, we were not met with any otherworldly response. The bloodletting into the sand continued until I began to blink harder to keep myself upright. The world felt cold, even though I struggled to keep up with the shade provided by the buildings. Percy looked at me with more concern. "That is a lot of blood you've lost," he pointed out. "Perhaps you should stop and regain some energy before continuing?" "I do not wish to lose any of the progress made. It is close, I can feel it," I insisted, my vision going blurry. At last, after a whole of 2 hours, I could no longer stand up straight. I toppled backward and breathed heavily, my lungs fatigued. "I cannot continue, Percy. I cannot stand." I finally accepted, my eyes closed in pain. "I must stop for the night." Percy did not reply. I cracked an eye and looked at him, witnessing his face had gone pale as he stared upward. I followed his gaze and gasped at the robed creature floating above us, its face shrouded in a dark hood. "Elemental?" I asked. It shifted toward me, answering my call. "We should not ask its challenge," Percy said, pulling out bandages to cover my open wounds. "You will perish." "I can always refuse and return another day," I said, familiar with how these elementals offered magic to others in the wild. "What is your challenge?" I asked, feeling ready for anything it might have despite my lack of energy. Grasping loosely, I held on to the bandage Percy offered. Even without being able to see facial features beyond the hood, I felt the floating creature sneer. I shivered. "If you do not accomplish my challenge at this moment, you will not be given a second chance. That is the way of Zagan. To win my magic, you must simply continue to supply me with this flow of blood for another 10 minutes, it answered, its voice like an ice storm against a glass pane. "You'll die," Percy protested as I stared hard at the bandage in my good hand, the other still bleeding. "There is no second chance. 10 minutes is not so long," I said, my voice weak as I dropped the bandage. The elemental breathed joyously, not having had someone accept its challenge in many years.